Welcome, my friends, to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 31 today. We're going to be looking at the topic movements of renewal. There's a big push at this time because of corruption that's going on in the church, because of problems in the separation of church and state, that the people have determined there needs to be reform. And there are some major figures that come along in leadership within the church that help bring about this reform. So we'll look at some of those people today. We'll look at some of the things they targeted as far as what they felt like were the most important things to reform. And then that'll lead us into next week. We'll complete this discussion by looking at the conflict that came about as the result of these movements of renewal. The violence and corruption that followed the decline of the empire awakened a deep yearning for a new order. There's a desire now that things change. There are some problems that have come along as the empire has declined and as power is shifting from a centralized government to the hands of feudal lords, and as a result of that into the hands of the church, because the currency of the day is land and the church owns a lot of land. And so positions in the church become very sought after, and this leads to a great deal of corruption. The papacy had turned into a bone of contention for rivals. There were a lot of people that wanted these positions, not because they felt led by God to be in leadership, not because people recognized that they were good leaders and wanted them in these positions, but because they were people that were looking for power and wealth, and they found a road to get to those ends by taking these church offices. And of course, if the church offices are an end to get to that power and money that people wanted, the biggest prize of all is going to be the papacy. And there are a lot of problems at this time with popes. There's a succession of them and some crazy stuff we talked about last week. So this is one of the areas that people see there is a big need for reform. Bishoprics were bought and sold. A practice that had gone on in the church at this time was that you could buy your position. If you really wanted it bad enough, there was a dollar figure attached. And as a result of that, the church offices were being sold, the churches were gaining money, or individuals within the churches were. Just a really despicable practice. It ends up being a big deal as far as this movement goes, but even movements that are to come with the way these leaders are appointed. So at this time, if you had enough money, you could buy one of these positions, and people saw that as being a problem. Many who took their faith seriously were outraged as they witnessed every part of the life of the church put at the service of the powerful. One of the big things we've talked about during the study is the change that came about with the church becoming legalized in Rome, the emperor Constantine becoming a part of the church and actually feeling like he was in charge of the church, and how that drew in the rich and the powerful. Before that, the church did not really have a lot of that. There were some that were higher in society that had come to be a part of the church, but by and large, it was led by and it was filled with people in the lower classes and people that were very poor. And we see now that this group of upper echelon, higher class, more moneyed and powerful people have taken key roles in the church, and they're really starting to take over. And people that were honestly just trying to live out their faith saw this as being a huge issue, and they were outraged to see the church and the faith that they held so strongly be turned into just another bargaining chip for somebody to gain a little bit more wealth and a little bit more power. And so this helped really stoke the fires for reform at this time. And then many who held a deep passion for reform had taken up the monastic life. So we see this throughout our study of church history, and it's really the reason that the monastic life began in the first place. There was a desire by people to get away from the church that had begun to get corruption within it, begun to draw people in that were maybe not necessarily coming into the church for the right reasons. People didn't feel like they could fight the system. Some did. But for a lot of them, the answer was to just get away from it. And so once again, at this time, there's a big push towards the monastic life. If this is the way it's going to be, if we're not going to be able to live out our faith in an honest way here, then it's time to move on to the monastic life. And so that's where this need for reform really centralized. truth is, though, there was a big need for reform within monasticism itself. There had been some of the same issues that were going on in the church at large were also a problem in the monastic life. Many monasteries had been looted and destroyed by Norsemen and Hungarians. We talked about these two groups that have come in at this time. They are targeting areas, they're targeting places that can gain them loot, that can gain them the nice things they want to send back to their country. And one of the big targets then becomes the church, because there are a lot of things that are of value even in these monasteries. Maybe not so much the decorative things, but food, very practical things, even people. They would take slaves as well. So they have come into these monasteries, and these groups have really wreaked havoc with them. But there are those that are in sheltered areas, but they weren't protected because they were corrupted by abbots and prelates who were not really doing their duty properly. And they were a part of this group that were buying and selling offices or just trying to gain everything that they could for themselves. So the monasteries are having big problems. If they're up and running, they're corrupt. If they're not, that probably means that they were looted and maybe even destroyed by some of these invaders that were coming in. Nobles and bishops were tasked with protecting them, but they tended to use these monasteries for their own benefit. They were the ones who were in charge. They were supposed to be taking care of the monasteries, making sure the people within them were safe, and yet they just were using them as a way to enrich themselves. Again, one of the big issues that outraged the common people of the church was to see this leadership being so corrupt. Some became abbots by buying their posts. We've already talked about that, or even by homicide. We even had this with popes, where popes were being deposed and killed, or they were being put in prison and dying in prison. Just real insanity going on within the church. And it didn't take very long before it became obvious that these people that are getting these leadership positions, they just wanted the wealth and the power, and they wanted to settle in, live the easy life, and use these abbeys' income for themselves. And that happened a lot. And again, it was a leading cause for people to say, we need to have reform in these monasteries. And then the rule of Benedict, the rule that had kind of been the law. It had been the set of rules that had been used by the monasteries for years, kept them on the right track. Well, now those have just been ignored, thrown out, thrown to the wayside. No need to keep going this way. No need to keep these standards up. If I'm in it just to live the easy life, then I'm probably not going to go along with this. And that was happening more and more. And so the monasteries were the place that this reform had to start. Duke William III was one of the very important figures in at least the beginnings of this reform movement because of his work in establishing a monastery. In AD 909, Duke William III founded a small monastery. This monastery became the center of a vast reformation. William chose Berno, a monk who was steadfastly obedient to the rule, to lead the monastery. So he found the right guy to take this monastery and really do it the right way. Berno asked William to donate his favorite hunting place, Cluny, for the monastery. William agreed to this, and he deeded it to Saints Peter and Paul. The way he did this is very important because he wanted to protect the monastery from these nearby bishops and feudal lords from getting their hands on them. So deeding them to Saints Peter and Paul helped with that. And it also helped to even keep the Pope from being able to take the monastery over himself. The Pope protected it, but it wasn't deeded to the church. It wasn't deeded to the Pope. It was deeded to Saints Peter and Paul. So that was done intentionally, and it was a good move to keep this place independent and to be able to continue to do the reform work that it was going to be a part of. Berno ruled Cluny until AD 926. He was followed by a series of able and high-minded abbots. These included Odo, Amar, Mayul, Odilo, and Yu. And these guys we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about specifically what they did, but they were a big part of keeping the reform movement going all the way from the time that the monastery was established through the year 1109. So a significant amount of time. and a lot of work that was done as a result of these guys' leadership. The abbots of Cluny soon set out to reform other houses, so they saw that what they were doing in Cluny was working. It was getting things done the right way, and they wanted to bring that to other places, so they started targeting other monasteries. They developed a series of second Clunies. These were independent monasteries that were directly under the abbot of the main monastery. So they operated independently, but they were under the abbot of Cluny, and they tried to do things the way that they had been done at Cluny in order to get the same results of Reformation at this time. So it was a big deal. This was kind of like churches that are franchised now, I guess, in some ways, where you have the same church name on churches all over the city or even in the state. But these were a little bit more independent than that, but they did stay under the leadership and did things the way they were done at Cluny. The main occupation of the monks and nuns of these monasteries was the divine office, or the celebration of the hours of prayer and scripture reading set out in the rule. This was done to the extent that even the physical labor prescribed by Benedict was neglected. At the height of the movement, 138 psalms were sung in a single day. That's a lot of psalms sung in a single day, and it required everybody to be involved in this. There's a reason why this took place. The monks in these monasteries, the nun at these monasteries, they wanted to spend their time doing this, and they felt like the physical labor was just getting in the way of what they actually wanted to do. The other reason is that because of the prominence of these monasteries, because of their holdings of land, they had a lot of money, they had a lot of value, and they had a lot of people during this reform time giving them money and helping to keep them going, but actually enriching these monasteries to the extent that they didn't really need people to work. The reason for the work in the first place was to keep the people honest, keep people working, keep these men and women doing tasks that even the person that was considered to be the highest in that order would do the lowliest task and rotate it around. So there were some big reasons for doing it, but it was also a practical reason. You needed food to eat. You needed to be able to have some things to sell to keep things going. Well, at this time, they didn't need that. They were being enriched. They had everything that they needed provided for, so they could spend their time in the divine office, and they didn't really have to do the physical labor part of this. Eventually, the Cluniacs set their sights on the reformation of the entire church, so they started seeing this movement work where they started it in Cluny. Then it spread to other monasteries that got on board with them. Now they're saying, it's not enough just to do this. We've accomplished what we wanted to in the monasteries. Now let's take this to the rest of the church, because there's definitely a need for reform all through the church. This was the time in which there arose a swift succession of popes. We've talked about this. And when popes and bishops became feudal lords. These positions became very powerful. They were too powerful. They were involved with things they should have never been involved with, and it was bringing corruption all through the church. This was the time in which there arose a swift succession of popes, and when popes and bishops became feudal lords. So we've already talked about the popes coming and going so quickly, rival popes. There was even a time where there were up to 3 people claiming to be the pope. Also, this is the time where these guys start to take on these roles that are not just church leadership, they're civil leadership, they're in government in some ways, and so the positions become way too powerful, and it's attracting the wrong people. So there needs to be reform, and the people in this Reformation that began in the monasteries saw it, they knew it, and they were out to make those changes. People who were not Cluniacs joined them in the goal of a general reformation following the monastic model. So one of the important things to realize about this is there was such a desire for reform among the people that even those that weren't involved with this group, even those that had never been to Cluny, had never been in a monastery, were not part of the monastic life, they supported this movement because they saw it as their one shot to get reform in. And what's important about that is there was widespread support for doing this coming from the monastery. So you've got people coming in that are bringing the values of the monastery to the church at large, and there's widespread support for this. Not that necessarily all the people wanted things done just the same way they were done in a monastery, I mean, these are people that have never been to a monastery. They've never been a part of a monastery. But they're so desperate for reform, they don't care how it happens. It just has to happen. And so that's what helped fuel this movement. The people were behind it because they so badly wanted reform. So the goal of ecclesiastical reformation was seen in the 11th century as an extension of what had started in the monasteries. And that's an important thing to remember as we go forward. So what were their targets of reform? What did they see that was so important that they felt like needed to be reformed? A primary dream of the reformers was a church free of obligation to civil authorities. We've talked about this a lot, that line between the separation of church and state. They didn't want the state involved in church affairs, but understand this, that didn't mean they didn't think that the church needed to be involved in civil affairs. They were not to the point yet of being able to say there needed to be a total separation. So the church is going to continue to try to run things in the civil world, but it's also going to continue to not want those civil authorities to come in and run them. And it's kind of hard when you start mixing both. So one of the things the reformers really saw was, let's get the civil authorities, let's get the emperor, let's get these princes, these feudal lords out of making decisions about the church. Something that needed to happen, and that was one of the things they targeted. Simony, which is the practice of buying and selling ecclesiastical posts, was another target of reform. Obviously, that is nothing but corruption. When you start talking about, well, you want to be in one of these offices, are the people looking at you as being a leader? Are they promoting you? Are you a person called by God to take this on? Oh, you're not? Oh, you just want it for your own power? Well, okay, how much are you willing to pay? And it happened, was going on way too much. Even one time was way too much, but it was going on widespread. And you can imagine the quality of leadership that was coming into the church. It wasn't people that cared about making the church everything it needed to be. It was people that were looking for their own benefit. They were looking for their own enrichment and their own power grabs. And so these reformers saw this simony. It had to stop. It had to go. And that was a big target of their reform. Another thing, the appointment of ecclesiastical leaders by nobles, kings, and emperors also needed to be forbidden. So this is different than simony in the fact it's not that these nobles, kings, and emperors are being paid. They're not selling the offices, but they wanted to be in charge of it. And these reformers saw again that they didn't need to have civil authorities making decisions about who the leaders of the church are. It's just rife with corruption when you do that. There's a lot of political reasons somebody might appoint someone to a post. And one of the lowest reasons on the list when it comes to politics is that that person is qualified and needs to be doing that job. We see that in our own political system all the time. So these reformers saw this and they said, simony needs to go, but also these civil leaders making the decisions about who needs to be elected to these posts, that's got to go too. A great enemy of Reformation was clerical marriage. Following the monastic example, the reformers promoted clerical celibacy as a universal rule. So understand at this time, this was not unique in the sense that it wasn't just being introduced at this time that a person in the clergy would need to be celibate. That was already going on. It was happening in the monasteries, but it wasn't universal even there. It definitely was not universal throughout the church, even though there had been some proclamations about doing it. They had been ignored for the most part. And these reformers saw this as being a central thing. And you might be wondering, well, it doesn't really make sense. Why do they care about this? There's a couple of reasons. First of all, they believed it needed to happen. They just believed that a person that didn't have family ties were going to be able to donate more of their time or spend more of their time in service to the church. And you read in the scripture, Paul himself said that. He said, I wish that everybody could be like me and not have a spouse, not have a family, and you just donate all your time to the church. You can spend all your time building the kingdom of God. But also in that same passage, Paul said, but if you need to be married, you should do it, because it's better to do that than to not be able to handle singleness. So prescribing this for all church leadership is never anywhere in the scripture, but it was already starting to happen in the monasteries. They want to bring this out. The other reason, there's a very practical reason about this, and it goes hand in hand with this desire to get rid of simony. One of the things that was happening was, once a family got a hold of one of these positions. They bought their way in or whatever, power grab, whatever it was. They tended to keep it and they would pass it down in the family. So if dad is the abbot, he paid for his position. Guess what happens when dad retires or he dies? All of a sudden, son becomes the abbot and on down the family. So these positions were not just being held temporarily by people that were willing to pay the highest dollar, they were being kept in families for generations. And so think about this as a reason for that. If you go ahead and say, okay, you can be in this position, but that means you're not married and you can't have any kids, that knocks that part out right off the bat. You don't have any children to pass it down to. That's a very practical thing that's being targeted here because of a corrupt practice that's going on. And so you can understand why it's happening, but the fact that it has become universal, I mean, it's universal now in the Catholic Church. The reasons for it maybe are not really so much in play anymore. But it's like a lot of these things in history. Once something starts, it becomes the way things are done, and it eventually becomes universal. And it's hard to ever change once that happens. And that is exactly what has happened. But understand what the reason was, at least at the beginning. They were trying to fight some corruption. That was a practical way that they found to do that. Universal obedience to the Pope was fundamental to the Reformation of the 11th century. So one of the big things these reformers wanted to do was centralize power with the Pope. They want this one guy to be able to make decisions of the church. And of course, they're going to make sure that that one guy that's in that position as Pope is one of them, so that they can continue this reform movement. If everybody has to listen to the Pope, then if you can get the papacy, then you've got everybody. So they were really big into centralizing power with the Pope. The Reformation of the Church in the 11th century ultimately failed. We're going to continue to talk about this, but understand there was some mistakes that they made as well. We'll look at some of what they were, but one of the biggest ones was that there was a great accumulation of wealth and land by the church at this time. Because there was such widespread support for reform, people tended to want to show that they supported what was happening by donating more. They donated more money. They donated lands. And so these bishops and abbots basically served as feudal lords, and monks failed to live the simple life of the rule because they were so enriched. The church had a lot of money. It had a lot of land. It had a lot of power. And nobody at this time discouraged that. They weren't out to try to just suck everybody dry and take every dollar they could. These reformers were not trying to do that. But they also didn't stop it. They didn't say, you know what, we need to go back to living the monastic life the way the rule says and be very simple life, not have all of these material things, not be able to just spend my day singing 138 psalms. I got to go grow some crops. I got to go work a little bit. They didn't want to go back to that. So they didn't promote it, but they also didn't discourage it, and it ultimately was one of the big factors that led to the failure of this Reformation movement, ultimately when it did fail. But we're not to that point yet, so let's move on. There are three figures that are very key to this reform movement. In AD 1048, Bruno of Toul, Hildebrand, and Humbert took this vision of Reformation with them on their way to Rome. Bruno had been offered the papacy by the Pope. He had already told him, you come on in and I'm going to make you Pope. Bruno said, no, I'm not going to do it that way. I want to be elected by the people. I want to set the example for the right way to do this. I don't believe that the emperor should be choosing who the Pope is. And so I'm not going to take it that way. I want to do it the right way. So he goes in to Rome, and we'll see in a moment, he goes in and does it what he feels like is the right way. Humbert fought forcefully against simony. So he was big on trying to fight the simony. He wrote against the simoniacs, a blistering attack on the powerful of his time. So he was a key figure in fighting simony throughout this Reformation time. And then Hildebrand was a monk in Rome under Pope Gregory VI. That Pope hoped to reform the church. He was the guy that tried to start the reform movement before it began, but it got derailed because Gregory ultimately abdicated when two other popes claimed to be the rightful pope, two other guys. So this was the time when we had three rival popes. Gregory was the one who had come in who wanted to try to set things up the right way, and he wanted to get things straightened out. But when there was two other guys coming in and there were people behind them and it was a big mess, he knew he wasn't going to be able to do that. So he just decided to abdicate. He left. He said, you know what? I'm not going to be able to do what I came here to do. So I'm not going to keep in this position and keep this turmoil going on. So he left, and he actually got exiled as a result of that. And Hildebrand followed him. So Hildebrand already saw the example of a guy who wanted to bring reform, and that definitely stuck with him. And then ultimately he helps to carry on that tradition as well. And eventually Hildebrand would become pope. And not surprisingly, he takes the name Gregory VII. So he goes along with honoring his leader, Gregory VI, and when he becomes pope, he becomes Gregory VII. After entering Rome as a pilgrim, Bruno of Toul was elected pope. He took the name Leo IX. Bruno comes in barefoot, and he's a pilgrim walking in just like every other one, but people were already behind him. They were cheering him as he came in. And he definitely had the support of people that wanted reform, and so as a result of that, he was going to be elected pope. It was just a matter of time, and he did. So he became the pope. He took the name Leo IX. His program of reform was based on the promotion of clerical celibacy and the elimination of simony. So those two big things that he really targeted, this group targeted, they went hand in hand. And already talked about this, but that promotion of celibacy was trying to keep these high offices from becoming just passed down in families. So they knew that there was a need to eliminate both these practices, simony, buying and selling offices, and then even the powerful, the rulers electing the leadership in the church. And they decided that the best way to deal with this simony as far as it goes with being passed down in families was just don't let there be any families. You don't have any kids, you can't pass it down. Therefore, he had the support of the masses who desired an end to the control of the church by the rich and powerful. So Pope Leo IX was a very popular pope, and he had widespread support among the people. Leo IX spread reform outside of Rome. He fought simony in Germany and France, where the practice was widespread. These were the two places that are going to cause him problems, and they're going to cause the guys that come after him problems, because they do not want to get rid of these practices. They want to buy and sell these positions. They want to be the ones electing bishops and abbots, and they're going to resist this reform movement and cause some big problems for these reformers. With all the good things that Leo did during his rule, he did make two big errors. One was that he took up arms against the Norsemen, and that didn't work out very well for him. He wanted to lead the fight. He was at the front of the line going in to attack them. Well, he got captured. He became a prisoner, and he remained a prisoner until shortly before his death. So they kind of took him off the board. They took him out. And that was a big mistake on his part to go ahead and make that charge. The second was that he sent Humbert as his legate to Constantinople. We talked about this already as well. This is in the time when there's this big schism. And you can remember we talked about a guy that came in that was very hardcore. He wasn't really trying to get everybody back together. He was the one that actually caused the permanent split. Well, that's this guy, Humbert. He comes in, he's a zealot. He didn't have any desire for unity. He wants things done the way these reformers say they're going to be done. He sees the corruption going on in the East. He sees the emperors picking all of the positions in the church. And he's part of a group of guys that say, no, we're not going to do that. He didn't bend on anything, and eventually it led to the schism that it never did come back together. The East and the Western Church stayed separated after that. Well, after the time of Pope Leo, there was a big question about how to go about electing the new pope. And it was difficult. The reformers resisted the emperor selecting him, but they knew that the emperor would pick somebody that would keep the Reformation movement going. So they liked what the result would be, but they couldn't go along with the process. They couldn't be hypocrites and say, let the emperor pick them. However, he also knew that if they allowed the Roman clergy and the people to elect the next pope, then they were taking a great risk, because that might allow the papacy to fall into the hands of a powerful Italian family, so that one of these families could come along, pay people off, exert influence, whatever, and they could get control of it and all the corruption's back. So they didn't know exactly how to handle it. They made a decision, though. They decided that they would let the Romans elect the new pope the way that it should be done, the way they knew it should happen, not the emperor. But they put a stipulation on it. That person had to be German. So that took the ability for any of these Italian families to gain power by taking this position. That just took that problem away. They couldn't get it because it had to be a German. So a decision that was made to stop this problem led to a German pope. And that new pope was named Victor II. And Victor continued Leo's policies of reform. He did a good job continuing on with those same policies that Leo had begun. And then following Victor was a series of popes committed to reform with one exception. That exception was Nicholas II. He didn't go along with the reform movement. And as a result of that, there was a council called the Second Lateran Council that was called in AD 1059. And that council decided how popes would be elected. They didn't want to take a chance of another Nicholas II coming in and not being on board with their movement. So the process went like this. Popes would be elected by the cardinals, who also held the title of bishop. So those cardinals that also were bishops, they were a select group and they got to pick the pope. Then they would seek the consent of the rest of the cardinals and then finally of the Roman people. But that group was central to picking the pope. And guess what? The pope, the current pope, got to pick who those cardinals would be. So this was a way to keep what they considered to be the right kind of guys in power. These reform-minded popes, they were basically in control of the process. If the pope's picking the people that are going to be the cardinals, then he's going to pick people that are going to do things the way he wants them done. And when he goes on, moves on, retires, dies, whatever it is, the next guy that comes along to take that place is going to be somebody that's of the like mind. So this is the system that was created at the Second Lateran Council in AD 1059, in which they determined the process finally of electing the Pope to get it out of the hands of the emperors, the leadership, and also to eliminate simony as being a part of this process. The first Pope elected under this new structure was Alexander II, and he continued the work of Reformation. That leads us to Pope Gregory VII. We've already begun a discussion about him. His name was Hildebrand, and he was the next Pope elected after Alexander II. And he took the name Gregory VII in honor of his mentor, Gregory VI. Gregory VII dreamed of a world united under the papacy. So he was really about centralizing power and expanding the power of the office of the Pope. To meet that end, he declared that the Bible should not be translated into vernacular languages in order to maintain Rome as the center of teaching and interpretation. So this is a huge problem, and it ultimately leads to one of the major points of the Protestant Reformation, the fact that the Bible was not translated into the language of the people. This Pope started that. And his reason for it was he wanted everybody to be dependent on the central church. And if you can't read the Bible, then you have to have somebody that can read it to you. The problem with that is that gives somebody way too much power over what you believe. I can read it to you word for word, or I could read it to you in a way that slants it a little bit more like what I want it to say. Or I can flat out fabricate things and say that the Bible says them, and you would never know because you can't read the book for yourself. This is a major misstep, error. I don't know what you call it. You can almost say it's absolutely evil to do it. I don't think his intention was that, but the Bible had always been written in the language of the people. It was written in the common way that people spoke. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek. That was street Greek. It was the language of the common man on the road. God always intended for people to be able to read his word and understand it for themselves without having to have somebody interpret it for them, read it to them, make it understandable. This guy goes along and he messes all that up. And it causes major problems. Just big time corruption comes of this. Very, very bad, and it causes a lot of problems. Well, Pope Gregory VII also desired to extend his authority to the Eastern Church as well as conquer lands taken by the Muslims. So he wanted to expand east. He wanted to get back over there to that Byzantine area. He would have liked to reunite the churches with him, of course, in control. And he wanted to go and retake some of these lands that had been taken by the Muslims. Remember, these Muslims had taken a lot of areas that had been very key places historically in Christianity, and now those places are not Christian any longer. They were Islamic. And this guy came up with this idea, let's go back and retake those lands. The plans didn't come into fruition. He wasn't able to reestablish his connection to the Eastern Church. He also was not able to send forces to invade the Muslims, but it planted the idea of invading the Muslims, and that would lead to the Crusades 2 decades later. We'll actually talk about that in a couple of weeks. I'm quite sure that you know what the Crusades are. I'm quite sure that you've at least studied something about that. We'll look at that in a little bit more in depth, but the seed for that idea is kind of planted at this time. Gregory would have liked to have been the guy that led this. He didn't get to, but his idea doesn't go away. A synod was gathered in 1070, and that synod condemned simony and ordered that all clergy be celibate. So Gregory led this movement, and he got the church to finally agree and to put in universal practice that they would not allow positions to be bought and sold, and also that all clergy, universally, not just in monasteries, but every member of the clergy would have to be celibate. They could not be married. They'd have to be celibate. That was not a good decision. Combining celibacy with his Reformation plans was unwise. The reason for that is it united many in the lower clergy with those who supported simony. Those lower clergy members, they didn't want these positions bought and sold either, but there's another thing they didn't want. They didn't want to have to get rid of their wives. Understand, when this edict came down, it wasn't a deal where you got grandfathered in if you already had a wife. No, you were supposed to get rid of your wife. You had to become a celibate. You had to start from that day forward. I'm no longer a married man. I'm no longer a husband and father or whatever. I'm just this guy. I'm just the monk. I'm just this position. And they didn't want to do that. And they decided, you know what? I don't agree with this other group, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we're going to combine together. And it gained support within the church with these people that wanted to continue the corruption because they didn't want to get rid of their wives. And you can understand that. A man doesn't want to have to dump his wife because some dude came along and said, well, guess what? You can't be married anymore. It would have been a lot better to have just said, from this day forward, all people that come in new can't be. The other ones, eventually the problem will eliminate itself. But no, they were hardcore, and Gregory didn't want to do that, and it led to big problems for him. And so next week, we're going to look at the conflict that came about towards these reformers because of the movement that they started and what they were trying to do. And it's major conflict. It's not just conflict with these lower clergy members. It's conflict with emperors and kings with armies. And boy, does it get wild. So we're going to talk about that next week. In the meantime, I hope you have a very blessed week. Thanks for joining me today. Hope to get back up with you again next week as we continue our journey through the history of Christianity. God bless.